Some things further in our recent reading in Leviticus and in 2 Kings. We see in Leviticus, as we get into that 19th chapter and the chapter before and some of what follows, I'm sure, the ethical treatment of others. When Jesus quotes or proclaims the two great commandments, the love thy neighbor as thyself, that's from Leviticus 19:18. Now in Leviticus we have also all the rules as to who you're not supposed to have any kind of sexual relation with, even uncovering the nudity of your near relatives. Notice that it is mentioned that as God's people you're not to do the kinds of things that were practiced in Egypt and the kinds of things practiced in the land that the Lord is bringing them to. And that includes sexual relationships between men and men, sexual relationships between men and animals, and sexual relationships within close family bonds. We can imagine how terrible and awful and confused things got in Egypt and in the land where these other nations are that God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their descendants forever. We also see the clarity that you're not supposed to follow in the most abominable of practices, and that if you do these things, you will surely be destroyed, and that even the community of God's people should take people who do these abominable practices and throw stones at them until they're dead out in the wilderness. Of course, this is very harsh stuff, but yet these kinds of practices apparently are so damaging to the community that they must be taken out. And you see, sin not only corrupts the person sinning, but the community around. Now, if we look at all the sacrificial issues of Leviticus, comparing them, I'm told, to what was practiced in other places, that the issue is what pollutes God's sanctuary. Notice persons are not proclaimed unclean forever, and they're not cast out of the community forever because of the usual kinds of things that make one unclean. They're not the ones that have to have the blood of the sacrifice sprinkled upon them. The blood of the sacrifice is offered at the Lord and in the Lord's presence and at the altar base, so that these sacrifices are to cleanse the holy place and God's dwelling, because God is sure to dwell with God's people. So keep these kinds of things in mind, and I hope that they're helpful. And as we hear about how God expects blood to cleanse God's dwelling with God's people so that the sanctuary may be pure, remember the sacrifice of the Lord Jesus Christ, and that his sacrifice once for all makes possible God's perpetual dwelling with us, as God's promised, that at some point there will be a covenant that is not about teaching knowing the Lord, but each one will know me, from the least to the greatest. And in 1 Kings and 2 Kings we find out that Israel indeed had gone into the practices of all the other nations, including offering newborn children to be burned up, offering children to the pagan fertility cult, offering children to Moloch. We find in 2 Kings, even kings of Israel had offered their own very children. And this is hateful to God, and that's why God punishes Israel and later Judah. And even kings like Ehud, who took care of and brought God's judgment upon Ahab and Ahab's descendants, as God promised through the prophet. Later on, we hear prophets talk about the sin of Ehud. Well, didn't Ehud purify the worship of God in the temple? Well, he did and he didn't. While he wiped out the worship of Baal in his reign and time, he did not go so far as to wipe out the idolatry that was done by Jeroboam after the kingdom split. So taking care of most of the problem is not enough. You cannot compromise the dwelling of God or God's promise or following God at all. And trying to compromise or not going all the way, well, you may escape some wrath, but judgment is still coming. So we can see those who intentionally follow all of God's law and word and keep the covenant and look to the Lord for help and not flee after the other nations or try to be like all of the other nations. There's God's mercy and blessing and promise, presence. But to compromise at all violates God's covenant and God's promise. And how far do you think one can go with compromise? These are the things we ought to be asking ourselves. And we also ought to be reflecting on how Jesus did not compromise and yet offered his whole self to bring us peace in him, that is right relationship in all things, right relationship with God, with neighbor, and with all of creation. Thank you. I hope these thoughts are of some help.